Okay, so let's talk a little bit about flow of control, about how Java programs execute. So Java programs execute line by line, starting with the first statement in main. So remember that main is the method that is invoked when we run a program, and then we just go line by line through the code in main. Now, when you hit a statement that contains a method invocation, whatever method you're currently in is paused, and the control jumps to that method and starts executing that method line by line. And then when that method is done, control returns to where it originated. Once you reach an invoked method and you start executing it line by line, that method is done when one of two things happen. Either you reach the end of the method or you hit a return statement. As soon as you hit a return statement, the method is done, it's over, control jumps out of that method and returns to wherever you were called from. Okay, so for example, we have in our tester program we just wrote, we have our main method. So this is where our execution is going to start. So we're executing code, all that code where we were declaring and initializing our variables. And then we hit a method invocation, d1.roll. So this means main gets put on pause and control jumps over to the roll method being executed on d1. And our code inside the roll method executes. Actually, it's not very long, but it does its thing. When we reach the end of that method, the roll method is done and control returns back to main. You can kind of think about this as now being unpaused, and it picks back up right where it left off and just keeps going and executing line by line by line. Okay? So keep that in mind when you're thinking about how your programs run, is this idea that we execute one statement at a time, and then we invoke a method. We kind of put the current method on pause, jump over, invoke the new method line by line by line until we finish that new method, and then we jump back to where we started, resume, unpause, and carry on. Now, when we're invoking methods, sometimes those methods take parameters and sometimes they don't. When methods do take parameters, we need to think a little bit about how that works. So remember that formal parameters are the parameters defined in the method header. So those are the ones that you list when you're writing the method, when you're declaring your method. Formal parameters can only be used within that method, and they last as long as the method lasts. So when the method is done executing, the formal parameters get forgotten, or as Java describes it, they get garbage collected. Okay, so once that method is over, those parameters are gone. That is why we need to do things like this. In our constructor, we pass in the title, the price, and the num seconds, but the only way that we can save that information to use it later is by storing it in an instance data variable. Because remember, our instance data variables stick around as long as our objects stick around, but our formal parameters are done as soon as the method is done. So when this method is done executing, these three variables will be garbage collected. They'll be forgotten. Okay? But the instance data variables will stick around. The instance variables for song 1, for example, will stick around as long as song 1 sticks around. And the instance variables for book 1 will stick around as long as book 1 sticks around. But the parameters, the formal parameters, those are forgotten as soon as the method is done executing. So the formal parameters, again, are those ones in the method header, like here or here. Okay. Actual parameters are the values we send in when we invoke the method. So once we want the method to run, whatever inputs we send in, those are the actual parameters. And how this works is behind the scenes, it's as if you have this assignment. Formal parameter equals actual parameter. So, for example, here is our formal parameter, the title. Behind the scenes, when we invoke this constructor in this line here, it's as if we have a line that says the title equals happy. And the price equals 0.99. And the num seconds equals 180. So when you invoke a method, think about that happening behind the scenes. Before the method ever starts executing, every one of these formal parameters is assigned the value of the actual parameters using a simple assignment statement like the formal parameter equals the actual parameter. So let's look at an example of this. Here we have a pretty simple method. It's an add method. It returns an integer, takes in 2 integers. and just has a local variable sum, sums them up, and returns that sum. Okay, pretty easy example. This is our method header. These are our formal parameters. This is a local variable. Here's our return statement. So all of these pieces should be very familiar to you now. You should start really understanding this terminology and being able to identify all these different pieces of the method. Now let's look at if we were to invoke that method. So here we have the add method. Again, our formal parameters n1 and n2. And let's say we were to invoke that add method. Here we have main, a main method. We have a local variable num, which I've initialized to 1. And then we're invoking our add method with num and 2. So these are our actual parameters. n1 and n2 are our formal parameters. Num and the value 2 are our actual parameters. And what happens is behind the scenes, it's as if we have these two statements. n1, which is the first formal parameter, gets the value of num. n2, which is the second formal parameter, gets the value of 2. So these statements happen before any other code occurs in the method. And that happens for every single method call. Every time you invoke a method, it's as if there's a behind the scenes couple of assignment statements saying the formal parameter is given the value of the actual parameter. Okay, so it's really important to understand that that's what's happening when you're invoking a method. Okay, again, it's like we have this line. Now we're going to revisit this idea later, but I just want to sort of plant a seed in your head that remember Java stores primitives and objects very differently. Primitives store the actual value right in place. Objects store a reference or a pointer or a memory location to somewhere else where all that information lives. What that means is when you're doing an assignment statement, what is the value of the actual parameter being assigned? Well, it depends. If it's a primitive, it's the actual value. It is what it is. But if it's an object, then what's actually being assigned here is that memory location. Okay? This is a complicated idea, and we're going to come back and revisit it later. But again, I just want to kind of plant that seed now to be thinking about how this might be different for primitives and for objects. Okay, so let's just revisit some of the things we've learned about our variables. We've now talked about 4 different kinds of variables. We've talked about instance data variables. Well, how do you know it's an instance data variable? It's declared inside the class, but outside of any method. When should you use an instance data variable? You use it when it describes an object. So that's the purpose of an instance data variable. It's the characteristics that describe an object. And where can that variable be used? Anywhere in the class. It's going to be private, which means you can't directly access it from outside the class, but you can use it in any method inside the class. Okay, then we've got local variables. We know they're local variables because they're declared inside of a method. You should use a local variable when you really only need a variable for that method and you don't need it anywhere else. Keep it local. You can use that variable only inside the method. And once the method is over, that variable is forgotten. It's garbage collected. What is a formal parameter? A formal parameter is a variable that's listed in the method header. So it's listed as part of the method declaration. When should you use it? Well, when you need input to accomplish a task. So when you need to bring something into your method in order to accomplish that task, make it a formal parameter. And where can you use that formal parameter? Well, you can only use it inside the method. Again, just like a local variable, once the method is over, formal parameter gets garbage collected. And then finally, we've got our actual parameters. These are the ones that are included in the method invocation. So these are the real values. These are the inputs we're sending in. So you use actual parameters when you're invoking a method and you need to send that information in. Okay? So these are the 4 different types of variables we've talked about. You should start to become very familiar with this terminology. It's important to understand the difference between these terms, when you can use them, when they can be accessed, and how you know what type of variable something is.